In the spring of 1498, Bologna's cobbled streets glistened with leftover rain, reflecting the domes of cathedrals and the clatter of horses pulling market carts. This was a city proud of its scholars, its law, its guilds, and its quiet ability to police behavior, not with brutality, but with bureaucracy. You walk along the Via Zamboni, where red brick buildings lean like tired sentinels. The air is thick with flour dust from the baker's door, and on this ordinary Tuesday you might not notice the girl crossing the square near San Petronio. She is modestly dressed in a slate-colored wool gown, her hair tucked in a linen coif. She carries nothing but a small pouch of bread for her father's supper. But behind the cathedral's tall, ribbed doors, the atmosphere changes. Whispered, ride the incense-laced air. Heads turn, because the girl, Agnes, daughter of Benedetto the tailor, is radiant, not flashy, not vain, but radiant in a way that Renaissance society considered suspicious. She does not speak loudly. She does not paint her lips or wear velvet slippers, but her cheeks flush naturally. Her skin is pale without powder, and her lashes cast shadows on her cheekbones, like brushstrokes on parchment. Men look longer than they should. Women mutter behind fans, and before the third bell tolls for evening prayer, the bishop's secretary writes her name down in the margins of a leather-bound complaint ledger, not because she broke a law, but because she existed beautifully in a public place. In Renaissance Bologna, beauty was not always a blessing. It was a form of power, a quiet rebellion, a challenge to the order of things. And for girls like Agnes, it was something to be controlled, categorized, and sometimes punished. The ledger note was filed under disturbances of decorum, a vague term used to cover everything from too much laughter in public to the mysterious presence of a woman who made men forget the sermon. It wasn't the first time her name had appeared. The week before, a guild leader had stumbled during a reading of city edicts, just after Agnes passed by the council steps. A priest had commented on her unsettling grace during confession, and a noblewoman who sponsored the tailoring guild had suggested, quietly, that Agnes might be better suited to indoor duties away from the eyes of the unmarried elite. No one accused her of a crime. That would have required evidence. But the city's sumptuary court didn't need a smoking gun. It needed only a pattern of discomfort. By early summer, Agnes's presence had been noted enough times that a committee was formed, not to charge her, but to remove her. They called it protective separation. In reality, it was exile. The court summoned her father to a small brick building near the university. There were no guards, just parchment, wax seals, and silence. He was told, gently, that his daughter's presence caused social imbalance, that her walk through the square had created moments of spiritual detraction, and that while she had committed no act of vanity, her appearance had become disruptive. He was offered a quiet solution: send her to the countryside, perhaps an aunt's farm, or a convent for a time, not for punishment, but for harmony. Bennett wept. He had stitched robes for the very men now asking him to disappear his daughter. He had made the bishop's cape, and now he was expected to unmake the life of the girl he'd raised with calloused hands and quiet pride. He asked if Agnes could at least remain until the harvest festival. They said no. The bishop's assistant offered a small purse of coins. For the journey, it was not a bribe, they insisted. It was a courtesy. And so, one day before midsummer, Agnes left the city she'd known all her life, not as a criminal, not as a seductress, but as a disruption. Be a visual offense in a world terrified of beauty it couldn't control. She was 16 years old. Her destination was a small village near the Apennines. Her crime, nothing at all, except being looked at and not looking away. But what happened to Agnes after her exile? Did the countryside offer protection, or simply silence? Asterisk. The cart creaked like an old door as it climbed toward the hills. Agnes sat wedged between sacks of flour and a copper pot that had lost its shine. The driver, a distant cousin named Luca, didn't speak much. He offered her a bit of honeycomb and a wool blanket, but avoided her eyes. Not because he was unkind, but because even a glance might be misread, retold, or punished. In Bologna, men had learned not to look too long. Out here, in the folds of the Apennines, people had learned not to look at all. The hills swallowed the city behind her. Stone gave way to pine, and bells to birdsong. She watched the transition through a slat in the cart's wooden frame. Her fingers pressed against the grain like a prisoner counting time. The village, Val di San Michele, was little more than a crooked lane and a chapel. The stream wound through its edge like a thread someone had forgotten to snip. Goats wandered freely. The houses were thick-walled and shuttered even in summer. The convent sat on a rise above the village, where fog gathered each morning like a veil that this was where she would stay. Not as a nun, not officially, but as a guest, under the eye of Sister Beatrice, a woman who had once been known for her music, but now spoke only in verses from Paul. The convent did not ask why she had come. They didn't need to. The church had its own way of filing. Away difficult women. Some were loud, some were scandalous, and some, like Agnes, were simply seen too much. Her days were quiet. Morning prayers, chores in the herb garden, meals without meat. She washed linens, stitched hemmed robes for traveling monks, and learned the rhythms of convent bells that marked every task from dawn to dusk. But what Agnes noticed most was the absence of mirrors. Not a single one. Not in the halls. Not in the cells. Not even in the tiny washroom near the chapel. Reflection, it seemed, had no place here. A woman's face was not meant to be studied, not even by herself. She asked once, gently, if she could keep the small mirror from her travel pouch. Sister Beatrice said no. The devil lives in reflections, she said. They whisper to the weak. Agnes did not argue, but she missed the little things, seeing if her lip was cracked or if the part in her hair was straight. She missed knowing how the world saw her. Out here, her beauty was not a burden. It was irrelevant. There were no men to gaze, no women to whisper, no quartz to weigh the tilt of her chin. And yet it did not feel like freedom. It felt like being erased. Each evening, she would sit beneath the olive tree behind the chapel and watch the mist roll in like cloth unfurling. She began to hum again, songs her mother had once sung while kneading dough. And when she thought no one was listening, she began to sing. It was not vanity, it was memory. The sound was the only mirror she had left. One evening, as she sang a line from a Tuscan ballad, a voice joined in, gravelly, male, out of place. Agnes turned quickly behind the wall. On the path leading up from the forest stood a man with a satchel slung across his shoulder. Not a priest, not a noble, a traveler or a herbalist, judging by the sprigs of wild rosemary poking from his belt. He smiled and held up a clay pot. "For the sisters," he said, "tincture of hyssop." Agnes lowered her eyes. Old habits returned. But he did not linger. He gave the pot to the convent porter, thanked them in Latin, and walked away down the hill. His voice, deep and warm, stayed in her ears long after he was gone. The next week he returned, and the next, each time bringing herbs or dried roots or bitter teas. He was known as Matteo of Fernano, a healer trained in Ravenna, though no one knew if his license was still valid. He seemed uninterested in authority, but he knew plants better than any man she had met. One morning, while gathering thyme, Agnes found him behind the olive tree. He greeted her like an old friend, gently, without alarm. They spoke. He asked why she was there. She hesitated. "I caused distraction," she said at last. "In a church." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "Did you shout, dance, preach?" "No, I sat and breathed. That was all." He did not laugh. He simply nodded. "Bend your crime," he said, "was existing too well." They talked more over the coming weeks, in low tones, in the language of plants and memories. She told him about her father's shop, about the velvet bolts imported from Venice, about the first time she realized people looked at her like she was something other than a person. Matteo never asked to see her face uncovered, never complimented her eyes or her skin. He asked what she liked to read, what she thought of olive oil, as a remedy for dry hands. He treated her not as a symbol, but as someone whole. And that, more than any judgment in Bologna, began to undo her, because no one had ever seen her that way before. But was it safe to be seen like that again, especially in a world where too much attention, even kindness, could be repackaged as proof of impropriety? Would her presence, once again, become too loud? The late summer sun softened everything it touched. The stone walls of the convent, the tufts of mint in the garden, the worn hem of Agnes's apron. Days passed like folded sheets. The rhythm of prayer and labor had dulled the edges of her exile, but something within her had begun to shift. It was not Matteo, exactly, though his presence had become the only interruption in an otherwise featureless routine. It was the memory of who she had been, or rather, how others had made her feel, visible, powerful, dangerous, all because of the shape of her face. The convent had taught her invisibility. Matteo reminded her that being seen was not a sin. One evening, Sister Beatrice summoned her, not with anger, but with a silence that carried the weight of many unwritten rules. They sat together in the vestry, the window shutter creaking against a growing wind. "You are content here," the sister began. It wasn't a question. It was a prompt. Agnes paused. "I am quiet here. That is not the same." A long breath. Sister Beatrice folded her hands in her lap, as if holding back something sharp. "There has been a request," she said at last. "From Bologna." Agnes blinked. "Your father has written," the sister continued. "He is ill, not gravely, but enough to miss the presence of his child." There was more. There always was. "The city has changed," Beatrice added. "New clerics, new council. The bishop's secretary has retired. There is no longer a file with your name on it." The implication was clear. She could return, quietly, without ceremony, without charge. But the world that once exiled her did not ask for forgiveness. It simply erased the evidence. Matteo found her the next day, near the rosemary bush. "They are sending me back," she told him. Her voice was steady. "To the city, to the noise, to the eyes." He knelt beside her and helped pull a stubborn weed from the earth. "Will you go?" She nodded. "My father is alone." He hesitated, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a polished disc, brass, aged, not quite a mirror, but reflective enough to show a blurred outline of her face. "Keep it," he said, "not to see yourself, but to remember that your face is yours, not theirs." It was the kindest gift she had ever received. Her return to Bologna was unmarked. No guards, no procession, just the quiet clatter of a rented cart and the hum of pigeons on tiled roofs. The shop was dimmer now. Her father had aged in her absence, his shoulders more sloped, his hands trembling as he folded linen. But when he saw her, he didn't weep. He smiled, as if she'd only been gone for an afternoon. They said little of the past. That was how survivors speak. But neighbors peeked from shutters. Some nodded politely. Others looked quickly away. And one woman, a former patron, murmured, "Still lovely. Pity." Agnes did not flinch. She reopened the tailor's ledger. She threaded needles with the same care her father once showed her. And in the evenings, she sat by the shop window, with a small oil lamp, stitching hems while the light outlined the shape of her cheek in the glass. Rumors began again. She looks directly at men. She walks alone. She laughed once on a Sunday. But Agnes no longer adjusted her posture to minimize her silhouette. She no longer lowered her gaze. And when the new bishop's aide passed her in the market and said, with a hint of warning, "You're hard to ignore," she answered calmly, "Then don't look." Over time, the whispers became tired. A younger merchant's daughter wore crushed velvet to church. A widow was seen with painted nails. Society had found new distractions, and Agnes, still beautiful, still dangerous to those who feared softness, kept her father's shop running until his final breath, then passed it on to an apprentice. She trained herself. She never married, never joined a convent, never left Bologna again. But in her sewing box, wrapped in a bit of old muslin, she kept Matteo's brass mirror, not to admire herself, but to remember that even in a world designed to erase her, she had once been seen truly by someone who didn't find that frightening. And sometimes, in the quiet hour before dusk, she'd hold it just so, not for vanity, not for rebellion, but for memory, because being beautiful was never her crime. It was the world's discomfort that stood trial and failed. The lagoon shimmered like molten glass beneath the early morning sun. It was 1507 in Venice, a city made not of land, but of reflections. Reflections in water, in polished marble, in the gilded domes of San Marco, but perhaps most dangerously, in mirrors. You walk through the narrow cale of Cannaregio, where the walls lean inward and laundry flaps like sighs from above. There's a woman just ahead of you. Her stride is measured, her dress simple, but her face, it catches the light, in a way that seems too perfect, too deliberate, as if sculpted, as if aware of being watched. Her name is Lucia, a glassmaker's daughter, and though she wears no jewels, no rouge, and no perfume, people cross themselves when she passes. Why? Because her skin is smooth as blown crystal. Her eyes catch candlelight like cut glass, and her home, nestled behind the glass furnaces of Moreno, contains an object that the city has quietly begun to fear. A full-length Venetian mirror, not a polished bronze sheet, not a cloudy pane, but a true mirror, crafted with mercury, silver, and secrets, so flawless it showed not just features, but moods. Her father was among the first to perfect the technique, working under contract with the Republic. Mirrors, no longer novelty items. They were power, and for a short while they were even outlawed from private use, because they stirred vanity. Yes, but also because they were thought to distort the soul. Lucia's family was granted an exception, but exceptions never sit well in the courts of gossip. When she turned 17, she became the subject of a strange kind of attention. Visitors to the shop lingered, not over goblets or chalices, but over her, and especially over the mirror in the parlor behind the shop. Women claimed it showed not only their face, but their secrets. A furrow in the brow revealing betrayal, a faint tremor in the mouth whispering of forbidden love. One merchant's wife fainted after seeing her own reflection. She claimed the mirror had aged her 20 years in a blink. It didn't matter that mirrors were simply tools. In Venice, where beauty and performance were everything, such a mirror was considered dangerous. Soon, whispers turned to warnings. Lucia, they said, did not cast a proper shadow. She spoke too little. She observed too much. And then the edict came, a sumptuary order, unsigned, unsealed, but very real, was passed through the merchant's quarter. Private ownership of full-length mercury mirrors was now improper, not illegal, but inappropriate for unmarried women of modest rank. Lucia, of course, was both. Her father protested. The Doge's clerks shrugged. No law had been broken, they insisted, but discretion was encouraged. Strongly, Lucia did not protest. Instead, she moved the mirror to the attic, wrapped it in black cloth, penned with it. Part of herself disappeared from public life, but not before something stranger happened. A notary, a widower named Marco, had become obsessed with her reflection. Not her in person, just the image. He came often to the glass with flimsy excuses, a chipped goblet, a broken flask, but always lingered near the parlor. One afternoon, he begged to see the mirror again. Lucia refused. The next day, graffiti appeared on the wall near the Bridge of Sighs. It read, "She traps men in glass." The rumor caught like fire. Children chanted it near the docks. One noblewoman accused Lucia of giving her a mirror sickness. And within a fortnight, the city council quietly opened an inquiry, not into Lucia, but into her father's workshop. They claimed it was about safety, about fumes from mercury, bow furnace codes, and guild violations. But everyone knew the truth. Venice had turned against the thing it once prized. The mirror that made people too aware, too reflective, too naked in thought, and Lucia, whose only crime had been standing still in the light, was told by the family's lawyer that perhaps she ought to visit relatives in Padua for a while. It was phrased like advice, but in Renaissance Venice, such advice was often a sentence. Lucia did not pack jewelry. She packed glass-blowing tools. She was not just a daughter. She had been learning, observing, and if she was no longer allowed to be seen, then she would become the maker of what others feared to see. But where could a young woman, beautiful, skilled, and now notorious, go to practice the art of reflection? And what would she create, once freed from Venice's delicate chains? Asterisk. The road to Padua was slow, not in distance. It was less than a day's ride along the Brenta River, but in memory. Each bridge passed reminded Lucia of the bridges she had avoided in Venice. Each villa seemed like a quieter version of the places she had been told not to enter. And the silence in her chest, the silence where her reflection used to live, pressed harder than she'd expected. Padua was no Venice. It was a city of scholars, not courtiers. Its air was filled with chalk dust, not incense. And though it lacked canals, it offered Lucia something more precious than water: anonymity. She stayed with her uncle, a tired man who taught geometry and wore his beard like a question mark. He welcomed her with open arms, but never asked why she came. That was the kind of mercy men in exile learned to give. Lucia did not unpack the mirror. She had wrapped it in dark cloth and tied it with the sort of knots sailors used for mooring boats. It stayed in the corner of her attic room, leaning like an unused doorway instead. She focused on work. Padua's University was one of the oldest in Europe, and it attracted not only students but thinkers of all types: herbalists, astronomers, prescribes, and in a small corner office near the anatomy lecture hall, an eccentric named Signore Cavalli. He was blind. He did not wear his blindness like a tragedy, but like an old cloak, worn, practical, and occasionally in the way. He had gone blind late in life, After years studying optical illusions and perspective in early Renaissance art, he now lectured on perception, how we see, why we see, what we miss, and had developed a theory that mirrors had once been used not to reflect beauty, but to train the mind. Lucia heard of him by accident. A grocer's boy spoke of the man who stares at nothing but sees everything. Her curiosity caught. She introduced herself as a visitor from Venice with experience in glass and metalwork. Cavalli asked her to describe her hands, not her face. She did. He invited her to join his experiments, and so, for the first time since the mirror had been shrouded in her attic, Lucia began making glass again. But not mirrors, not at first. Built convex lenses, polished spheres, glasses that distorted rooms into spirals. Cavalli said they were mirrors for the brain. Lucia didn't quite understand, but she felt the old warmth in her fingers again, the hum of shaping fire into something solid. Weeks passed. Then, one day, Cavalli made an unusual request. "I want to remember what I look like," he said. "Not from memory, from feeling." Lucia paused. "I am blind," he said, "but my mind still reflects. Build me a mirror that shows what I am now, not what I was." She thought long into the night, and finally she did what no one in Venice would have dared ask of her. She uncovered the mirror. It was still intact, the surface smooth, but dulled slightly by time and her fear. She adjusted the curve, tilted the backing, changed the balance so that it offered not just a reflection, but an impression, a smudge of presence. The kind of reflection that caught only the weight of a person, not the features. She presented it to Cavalli in silence. He placed his hands along its edge. "I can feel it," he said. "I can't see it, but I feel it looking back." It was the strangest thing she'd ever heard, and the most honest word spread quietly, whispered between scholars and scribes. Lucia, the woman from Venice, was making mirrors that didn't flatter or reveal, but listened. Mirrors for those who had no eyes. Mirrors that showed shapes of breath, not cheekbones. Curves of thought, not waistlines. Soon visitors came. A widow who hadn't looked at herself since her husband died. A nun who wanted to know if her faith still showed on her face. A painter who had gone mad from too many colors and needed only light. Lucia made a mirror for each of them, all different, none of them beautiful. And for the first time, her skill was praised not as seduction, but as craft. One day, a young apprentice from Murano arrived. He bore a note, unsigned, sealed in wax. It read only, "The Doge's new wife requests a mirror that does not show her face, only her future." Lucia burned the note. She made no mirror. She realized then that Venice would always want her back, but only on its terms. Only if she made things to serve its illusions, its masks, and she would not go back to that. But could a woman like Lucia, one who had been told her reflection was too much for polite society, ever be allowed to make peace with her own? Would the city forget her, or would it one day try? to own her again. The attic room in Padua grew quiet over time. Fewer visitors came now, not because Lucia's mirrors had lost their appeal, but because they had become legend. People told stories of them like parables. The mirror that whispered truth to the blind, the one that refused to show a liar's reflection, the one that fogged up when a person pretended to be happy. Lucia herself remained quiet. She did not seek patrons. She made mirrors when asked, and even then, she asked more questions than most were prepared to answer. One question always came. First, what are you hoping to see? She once asked it of a soldier who brought her a small piece of silver and said he wanted to see courage. When she asked again, "What are you hoping to see?" he wept and left without the mirror. Not everyone was ready for reflection. But one morning in the winter of 1510, a knock on the door returned her to the world she had left behind. A well-dressed woman stood in the courtyard, not veiled, not disguised. Her manner was direct. She introduced herself as Contessa Bianca d'Ustinian, a cousin to one of Venice's most powerful magistrates. She did not speak like someone requesting a favor. She spoke like someone delivering a command, wrapped in the illusion of civility. She asked for a commission, a large one. The Doge's summer residence in the hills was being renovated, and it needed mirrors, not for vanity, the Contessa said. For legacy, Lucia said. No. The woman raised a gloved hand. You misunderstand. This is not a request. She offered a scroll sealed in the stamp of the Doge's office. It was not a warrant, but it might as well have been. Lucia stared at the paper, feeling the damp weight of Venice pressing down again. It was never satisfied to exile someone quietly. It always needed them back, as ornament, as symbol, as cautionary tale. That night, Lucia uncovered her very first mirror, the one she had made as a girl, the one that once hung in her father's parlor, the one she had wrapped in cloth and nearly forgotten. She looked into it. Her reflection stared back, older, thinner, more defined, but still her. And around the edges, something she hadn't seen before. Faint hairline cracks, like veins in marble. It was still whole, but it had changed. She lit a candle, held it close to the surface, and as the light flickered, she remembered something Matteo, her old friend in Padua, had once said. Years ago, during a lecture, the mirror is not truth. It is choice. You choose what you see, and you choose whether to believe it. Lucia exhaled. She walked to the small furnace she kept in the courtyard shed, a place where she used to heat glass. She placed the mirror carefully, reverently, into the hearth. She lit the flame. It cracked slowly. Then, all at once, shards curled inward like fallen petals. Silvered backings hissed. The room filled with the scent of old mercury and new air dots. She watched it all without blinking. The next morning, she packed her things not to flee, but to walk slowly back to Venice. On her terms, she met the Contessa at a public square near the docks. The Doge's representative was present to an accountant of sorts, who clearly expected contracts to be signed. Lucia offered them a small wooden box. Inside was a single mirror, but it was not silvered, not decorative, not valuable. It was cracked, edge to edge, carefully, intentionally, still held in place by its frame, but unusable as a tool of beauty. The Contessa recoiled. "What is this?" Lucia answered. "It's what happens when you try to make something show only what you want." She turned, walked away, and for once no one followed. Back in Padua, she continued her work, but fewer mirrors now, more glass for science, for astronomy, for students who needed to see the stars before they could name them. By the time she was 50, people no longer whispered her name in Venice. New scandals had taken root. New women had been deemed too much and quietly removed. But somewhere in a warehouse near the Doge's palace, there remained a cracked mirror in a cedar box. It was never discarded, never displayed, because even broken things, especially broken things, have a way of revealing the truth. And Lucia, she never looked into another mirror again. Not because she feared what she'd see, but because she no longer needed proof of who she was. Ferrara, 1483, a town of pale brick towers, slow river curves, and shadows that moved like rumors down narrow alleys. It was a city famous for poets, frescoes, and silk, but also for silence, the kind of silence that settled around a person when they were different, or unnoticed, or both. On the edge of the San Paolo district, tucked between a candlemaker's stall and a spice merchant's door, lived a woman known only as La Furia, the flower woman. Some said her name was Benedetta, others called her Myra, but most avoided her name entirely and spoke instead of what she looked like. She had lavender eyes, not grey, not blue, lavender, pale as pressed violets in snow. Children said she could see disease before it happened, that if she touched your forehead and frowned, you'd fall ill within a week. Women swore she whispered to herbs before crushing them. Men claimed her voice was too soft to be harmless, and yet she was called upon in every difficult birth, because beneath the suspicion and fear there was something stronger. Need. She had delivered half the babies in Ferrara's southern quarter, with hands like river-worn stone and a silence that made screaming women feel understood. She rubbed chamomile on foreheads, whispered prayers in old Latin, and sometimes, when the labor was bad, she would hum. That hum became legend. They said it could turn breech babies, that it echoed through the walls like a thread tying the mother to something older, steadier, calmer than pain. But nothing beautiful lasts unnoticed. It was during the Lent of 1483 that the whispers sharpened into something more dangerous. A nobleman's wife, Bianca del Martino, had struggled with childbirth. She had been told not to summon La Furia. Too risky, too lowborn, too strange. Instead, a court physician was called. The child was stillborn. The midwife never spoke of it. But within a week, she had been blamed anyway. A maid claimed she saw La Furia staring at the house days before the birth. A monk said the lavender in her basket was too pungent to be natural, and a merchant's wife, who had long envied the midwife's presence, whispered that she'd once seen her bathing under a blood moon. None of it was true. All of it was believed. Ferrara, like much of Italy at the time, had begun slipping into a strange kind of fear, a mixture of Renaissance learning and medieval dread. The printing press had arrived. So had classical texts, and alongside them new books on demons, omens, signs. The more people knew, the more they feared what could not be known. A woman with rare eyes who hummed during births, who never aged, never married, never confessed. It was easier to call her Strega, which the first summons came quietly. A letter from a local priest, an invitation to speak, not a trial. She did not go. The second was firmer, from the Duke's Chancellor, a formal request to explain her methods. Still, she did not go. On the third request, they did not wait. 3 guards came to her door at dawn. They knocked once. She opened it before the second knock, as if she knew. They took her without chains, but with silence. She was placed in a stone room beneath the old infirmary. Not a dungeon, exactly, but close enough. A table, a chair, a candle, no bed. A friar questioned her first. He asked about the herbs, the oils. She answered plainly. He asked if she'd ever read from books not approved by the church. She said she couldn't read. He asked if she believed in spirits. She said she believed in silence. And when he pressed her gently, but with purpose, she simply said, "Pain makes people believe in many things. I just try to make it quieter." They kept her for 3 days. On the 4th, something unexpected happened. A woman came to the infirmary, pregnant, pale, bleeding. The Duke's niece, the court physician, was away. The friars refused to call on La Furea, but the guards, they hesitated, and one, a man whose own wife had once been helped by the midwife, unlocked the door. She went without a word, upstairs. In the small chamber where the young noblewoman trembled between life and death, the lavender-eyed woman worked. No chants, no spells, just warm water, steady hands, a knife boiled and wrapped in linen, a baby boy breathing, and a mother saved. She said nothing when it was over, returned to the cell on her own. The friars did not question her again, but the damage was done. Even a miracle birth could not undo the shadow of suspicion. A week later, she was released. No charges, no apology, and yet no one came to her door. Again, the same people who once begged for her help now crossed the street to avoid her. The same women who once wept in her arms now warned their daughters to avoid her touch. She had saved their lives, but she had seen too much. And what happens to a woman who sees too much and survives? After her release, La Furia did not move. She remained in the same crooked room behind the spice merchant's store. The walls still smelled of rosemary and damp stone. The floor still groaned when it rained. But now, something in the air had shifted. It wasn't hatred. That would have been easier. It was fear, stretched thin like smoke that never quite clears. The lavender-eyed midwife no longer received knocks at her door. No bundles left in the night with coins and notes that read, "She's early or the bleeding won't stop." The river of women who had once come in secret, nobles and peasants alike, had dried up, and yet she stayed. Not to be brave, not for revenge, but because her work, like her presence, had always been quiet, and she knew better than anyone that silence does not mean surrender. Instead of healing bodies, she began healing the ground. She returned to the wooded edge of Ferrara, where the River Po curved like a crooked finger. There, beneath the willow trees, she planted lavender, mugwort, angelica root, not to sell, not even to use, but to listen. She had always said herbs spoke back, that rosemary could hum, that chamomile breathed shallowly if crushed without reverence. People laughed then. Now they simply avoided the path where she walked, as if the plants themselves had learned to whisper her name. But one did not. A young girl, no more than 12, began following her at first. La Furia ignored her. Children came and went. Curiosity passed like spring rain. But the girl kept appearing, not speaking, just watching, quiet as her own shadow. On the 7th morning, La Furia turned. "You've followed me all week," she said. The girl nodded. "Why?" The girl held up a small satchel. It was sewn clumsily from an old sleeve. Inside were bruised petals, dried stems, crumbled bark herbs. The midwife asked. The girl shook her head, then whispered, "Memory." Her name was Sophia. Her mother had died 2 winters earlier, not in childbirth, but from a fever that came quickly and left too little behind. Since then, Sophia had been collecting things she remembered from her mother's hands. The tea she brewed, the bath scent she used, the poultice she made when Sophia scraped her knee on the bakery step. No one would help her identify them now. Her aunt said it was witch work. Her uncle burned her little herb satchels when he found them. But she kept trying. The midwife did not smile, but she gestured for the girl to follow. For weeks, they walked the marshy edges of the town. Sophia learned the names, the temperatures, the scents that changed with drying time. She learned how to pick without bruising, how to bundle thyme with one hand, how to dry calendula without stealing its color. But mostly, she learned to listen, because La Furia taught without voice. Her words were few. Her hands showed more than her mouth ever could. One afternoon, as they harvested meadowsweet beneath a low fog, Sophia finally asked what no one else dared. "Why don't people come to you, anymore?" The midwife did not answer right away. She pinched the stem of a dandelion and let its fuzz drift between them. Then she said, "Because I didn't die." Sophia frowned. "They made me into a story," the woman continued, "and stories are easier, pet to control when they end." The girl was quiet. Then she asked the question even adults feared. "Are you a witch?" The midwife looked at her, really looked, and said, "No, but I'm not ordinary either." That night, someone scratched a symbol into her door. A crooked cross with an extra arm, a local sign for unclean woman. She wiped it off with a damp cloth and didn't mention it to Sophia. But she moved the girl's lessons deeper into the woods. That there, among thistles and wind, they planted a new garden, not for healing, not for sale, not even for beauty, but for remembering. They called it Il Giardino del Dimenticate, the garden of the forgotten dot. Sophia made little clay tags for each plant, not with their names, but with what they had been used for. The flower that eased my mother's cough, the leaf that warmed my uncle's feet when he couldn't stand, the root that made the baker's hands stop shaking. The stories grew with the herbs, but so did the eyes watching from Ferrara. Whispers began again. She has a pupil now. They're building a potion farm. I saw a crow land on her shoulder. None of it true, all of it useful, for those who still needed someone to blame. And then, just as the spring thaw began to spread through the city, the knock came. Not from a priest, not from a court official, but from the wife of the very same magistrate who once signed her release papers. She stood in the dusk, wringing her hands, her belly round, her face pale. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. The midwife opened the door without a word. Sophia brought the water. The herbs were boiled. The hum returned, low, steady, older now, and the child was born before midnight. A girl, quiet, breathing, wide, dash-eyed dot, with lashes like ink and a gaze that reminded everyone of crushed lavender in moonlight. But what happens when the world, once again, sees beauty in something it cannot explain? The birth of the magistrate's daughter should have restored her. That's what the woman had said, eyes wide with a hope she hadn't earned. "People will see now," she whispered, clutching the baby to her chest. "They'll know you're good." But Ferrara didn't work that way. Truth was not a currency there, only appearances were. The midwife knew this. She had known it the moment the child let out her first cry. Strong, certain, innocent, and still no one from the magistrate's household had come to escort the mother home. She had walked back alone, just before dawn, with the child bundled in her arms like a secret. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived, wax-sealed, no signature. It didn't accuse. It didn't even threaten. It simply advised the midwife to refrain from receiving guests unrelated to herbal commerce, and to consider relocating if further disturbances arise. The final line read, "We recommend silence." She burned the letter without unfolding it fully. Sophia watched it curl into ash, and did not ask what it meant. But that week, a stone was thrown through the garden gate. The next, the herbs were trampled by boots, not children's play, but deliberate stomping. Mugwort uprooted, sage crushed, calendula torn and left in the stream like litter. And finally, one night, the door to her home was left open. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just left ajar. A message. The midwife packed nothing. She walked the garden with Sophia one last time, pressing small notes into the soil near each plant, not in Latin, not in code, but in clear writing, as if the herbs themselves deserved to be named properly before the forgetting began again. That night she vanished. No one saw her leave. No cart, no trail, no belongings. Only a small oil lamp left burning by the window. Ferrara's rumors bloomed instantly. She was summoned by devils. She turned into fog. She wandered into the river and became a fish. Some said they still heard her hum on cold nights. Others claimed she returned to help women in secret, always unseen, always just before the midwife on duty arrived. But none of it could be proved, except for one thing. Sophia remained. She took up the house, rebuilt the garden, and when anyone asked if she had been taught by La Fieraia, she would say only she reminded the plants who they were. Years passed. A new magistrate came. A new friar took over the parish. The city shifted its fears toward alchemists and wandering scholars. People stopped whispering about lavender eyes, but not entirely. A traveler once arrived in Ferrara, claiming to have passed through a town where a woman lived in a stone cottage covered in vines. She never showed her face, but when a child was sick, a note would appear on the doorstep, a folded square of birch bark with instructions written in soot dot. Sometimes the paper smelled of rosemary, sometimes of burning sage. And once, only once, someone swore they saw her shadow, bent thin, but unmistakably still watching. Sophia never left Ferrara. She taught other girls, quiet ones with questions too big for churches, and hearts too soft for courts. And on the anniversary of the day the midwife vanished, she would light the same oil lamp in the window, not in mourning, but in memory, because La Fieraia had not been burned, not hanged, not tried. She had simply disappeared twice, first from society, then from need, and somehow that was more frightening to the city than any spell, because a woman like her didn't need revenge. She needed only to be remembered. And what if, just what if, that memory was more powerful than the fear that tried to erase her? Florence, 1467. The city hummed like a spinning wheel. Lutes drifted through open windows. Paint dried in courtyards. And beneath the glory of domes and frescoes, laws were being written, not just about taxes or trade, but about how much gold a woman could wear on her shoes. It was the golden age of the Medici, a time when Florence dazzled, art flourished, poets drank from marble fountains, and tailors stitched velvet sleeves so wide they could hide secrets in them. But behind the elegance was a panic, a fear that Florence's beauty was becoming too loud, too expensive, and far too tempting. So the city passed laws, dozens, then hundreds. They were called leggi sumptuary laws, rules that governed not crime, but clothing. A way to tell people how not to sparkle. Only 2 rings per hand. No embroidery in more than 3 colors. Brides may not wear pearls if their dowry is under 300 florins. Hair must be covered after age 16. No lace imported from Milan. And perhaps, most importantly, no unmarried woman of merchants. Rank may wear silk in public unless granted explicit, written permission from the guild. The rules were endless, but Florence was full of beauty, and beauty resists rules. Her name was Tessa Ricci. She lived 2 streets from the Ponte Vecchio, in a home pressed so tightly between its neighbors that one could open a window and shake hands with a stranger across the alley. Her father ran a modest wool stall. Her mother had died young, but Tessa had learned everything there was to know about dyeing cloth, choosing thread, and how to catch a stitch just by listening. And when she turned 17, she became the most talked-about girl in her quarter, not for her wealth, or family, or scandal, but for her dress. It was a soft, clove-brown silk, plain at first glance, but closer inspection revealed delicate embroidery at the cuffs twisting vines, stitched in a muted green. Her neckline was modest, her sleeves unadorned, but the sheen of the fabric, even in candlelight, gave her away. Dotted was real silk, and it moved like smoke. No one could prove where she got it. She said it was her mother's. The guild said her family never registered silk ownership. A neighbor swore she'd seen the girl buying thread from a trader who once smuggled fabrics through Pisa. None of it mattered, because the sumptuary commission had noticed. The commission was a special panel 3 men chosen from the guilds, 1 from the city council, and 1 friar tasked with preserving Florence's moral and financial dignity. They monitored festivals, weddings, markets, churches, anywhere. Someone might be tempted to wear something too expensive for their station. The commission summoned her father first. He came alone. They asked polite questions about income, about trade routes, about the presence of velvet in the household. He denied everything. He was not lying, but truth had never been the commission's priority. The next week they summoned Tessa. She wore the same brown dress, not to provoke, but because it was the only good garment she had left. The hearing was held in a narrow stone chamber behind the Wool Guild's hall. No audience, no trial, just a long table, 3 candles, and 5 men in plain robes who could fine a family into ruin without ever raising their voice. They asked where the silk came from. She answered, "It was a gift." "From whom?" "My mother." "But your mother died 12 years ago. She left it for me." "Was it registered?" Tessa shook her head. "Then you wore it illegally." She nodded, not out of guilt, but because she knew it would not matter what she said. They asked if she had worn it to church. She said yes. They asked if she knew how it might tempt men. She said no. They asked if she had danced in it. She said yes. That answer was a mistake. Dancing in silk, for an unmarried merchant's daughter, was viewed as flaunting status, dangerous, unbecoming. The friar shifted in his seat. The man from the council began to write. Her penalty, 50 florins. But that wasn't the real punishment. The real punishment was public record. Her name would be listed in the ledger of excess, in the registry of women who had defied Florence's dignity. Future marriage contracts would include a line asking if the bride had ever violated sumptuary law. Her answer would have to be yes. And yet, when she left the room, she did not cry. She folded the brown dress carefully into a satchel and walked home through the market as though nothing had happened. But how did a simple girl with one silk dress become the center of a scandal that would change Florence's sumptuary laws forever? And who, quietly watching from a second-story window, decided to take her side? Asterisk. Tessa's name was written in the ledger, in crisp Latin, with a fine quill. Richie, Tessa, brown silk, unregistered, worn to Santa Trinita, danced, fine, Wusher, Florence, stamped, dated, and filed among the scrolls in the stone archives beneath Palazzo della Signoria, where Florence kept all things that mattered, and all things meant to shame. But if the commission thought the scandal would end there, they were mistaken, because Florence was a city of gossip, and every fine printed became an echo. Some whispered that Tessa had done it on purpose, a performance. Others said she was seduced by a nobleman and had worn his silk to spite his wife. And some, mainly older women in the weaving district, said something far more dangerous, that she had done nothing wrong. Within a week, merchants were divided. Some praised the commission for preserving order. Others grumbled about hypocrisy, noting that the daughters of richer families had worn worse and never been summoned. But those girls had uncles in the guilds. Tessa had threadbare sleeves, and a father too honest to bribe. Asterisk. And then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, folded into thirds. No wax. Slid under her father's door. No greeting. Just a short message in charcoal script. You wore it well. I'd like to make you another. Say yes by placing rosemary in the northern stall of the Dyer's Row before sundown. There was no signature. Tessa hesitated. It smelled like a trick, but something about the note, its simplicity, its lack of flourish, felt genuine. Not flirtation, not threat, just attention, honest and watchful. That evening, as the bells tolled vesper hour, she walked to the Dyer's Row near the Arno and placed a sprig of rosemary in the splintered slat of a table that hadn't been used in weeks. She didn't stay. 2 nights later, a knock, not at her front door. At the rear, where deliveries came, where dye barrels were unloaded, a parcel, unmarked, wrapped in linen. Inside, a bolt of fabric, not silk, but something stranger. A blend, rougher, heavier, but warm to the touch. Dyed deep indigo, with hints of violet where the threads caught the light. On a scrap of parchment pinned to it, Florence sees color and calls it sin. We call it story. Stitch yours. Tessa knew what this was. Contrabando, Tessel textile smuggling. And yet, this wasn't theft or luxury for its own sake. This was statement. She worked by lamplight, quiet stitches, no pattern, just instinct. The dress that emerged was simple, but cut with a strange grace. Sleeves that flared just slightly, hems lined with a color Florence didn't quite have a name for. She wore it once, at dusk, to the grain market, and every eye turned. Not because she shimmered, but because they didn't know what they were looking at the next day. Another letter. The thread you used is from Luca. Illegal unless declared. Be careful, or be louder. Who was writing? Tessa began to piece it together. Not one person, but many. A quiet group, weavers, dyers, seamstresses, fed up with the way the city punished beauty while pretending to protect it. Women who had been fined. Men who'd been banned from guilds for using colors reserved for nobility. Apprentices who'd lost work because they sold too many spools to the wrong customers. Together they had formed an underground network, called it l'ombre mobile, the soft shadow. They made nothing to sell, only to resist. Tessa became their symbol, not their leader, just their echo. The girl in the brown silk dress who dared to dance. Soon more dresses appeared, subtle, silent, but present. A girl at Santa Maria Novella wore sleeves lined with indigo stitching. A woman at the fish market walked with a scarf made from Daiwan spanned in the Republic. And all of them moved as if they had nothing to explain. The commission noticed, and they panicked. They increased fines, doubled the number of inspections, posted friars at festival entrances to measure hem widths and count gemstones. But for every woman scolded, 2 more wore bolder thread the next week. Tessa did not hide. She appeared in church with a neckline 1 inch too low. She visited her father's stall with stitching not allowed for unmarried women. She greeted the wife of the very magistrate who fined her, and wore green gloves while doing it. But Florence is not kind to those who persist too long. And one morning, a new law passed. No appeals for sumptuary violations. Repeat offenders to be subject to civic banishment. Names to be printed publicly, not just in the city's archive, but in every quarter. And whose name appeared first? Tessa Ritchie, the girl with the smoke-brown dress. The weavers whispered, "Leave." Her father begged, "Stop." But she stayed, because the dress was never the crime. The crime was being seen, and not apologizing for it. But could she endure a city bent on shaming her into silence? Or was exile the final thread Florence always intended to pull? Asterisk, the banishment was quiet. No public trial. No carriage to carry her out. Just a scroll nailed "Poor" to the wooden post outside her father's shop, printed in thin black ink. Without fanfare, Tessa Ritchie, twice fined under sumptuary law. Citizenry revoked. Trade access withdrawn. Resonance discouraged within the bounds of the city. Commune, it did not say where she should go. That was the cruelest part of Florence's punishments. They didn't push you out. They pulled the ground out from under you. Contracts vanished. Guild protections evaporated. Landlords stopped answering the door. You could stay, technically, but no one would rent to you. No one would sell you flour. No one would take your hand in marriage. Not even in secret. Florence made you a ghost. Her father wept. He pleaded with the wool guild, swore that he alone had ordered the dress, that his daughter had been a child. But they had already decided. The city needed an example, and Tessa had given them too many chances to make one. She packed only what she could carry. Left the silk behind, wore the same wool cloak she used in the rain, and on her last day she did not cry. She visited the Arno one final time, the bridge where street performers danced in spring, the bench where she once saw a tailor propose to a dyer. She stood there until the bells rang, and the pigeons startled upward as if remembering something they'd long forgotten. She left without ceremony, and yet Florence did not forget her, because the moment she vanished, something began to grow. Women, tailors, spinners, housekeepers, began folding thread into their garments. Small things, hidden things, a seam stitched with goldenrod thread, a collar lined with forbidden velvet, buttons carved from smuggled glass, not grand, not theatrical, just enough to say, "I remember." 1 month later, an anonymous dress appeared in the market, hung quietly on the back wall of a fabric stall, made of dull cotton, but hemmed with tiny green ivy leaves, symbols of endurance. Inside, sewn behind the neckline, one word, Tessa. No price, no name. It was gone by nightfall. Then another appeared at the Painter's Square, then 3 at a candle market, then 7 in the leather district. No one claimed them, but everyone knew. The soft shadow had returned, not as smuggled bolts of silk or loud protests, but as a slow, unshakable memory that Florence could not scrub from its cobblestones. Some women began to request the Ritchie cut from seamstresses, a subtle drape over the shoulders, like the brown dress she wore to church. Others stitched their own names into linens, daring the commission to call them excessive for simply existing with care. And then, 1 season later, something truly strange happened. A new edict was issued, not to loosen the laws, but to withdraw them quietly, slowly, without explanation. First, the rule about sleeve length, then the ban on lace from Lucca, then the limit on how many buttons a woman could wear on her cloak. Within 2 years, the Sumptuary Commission shrank. Fewer inspectors, fewer fines. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even mercy. It was fatigue. Florence could not keep up with the quiet resistance. Tessa never returned. Some said she married a sculptor in Siena. Others claimed she worked in convent garden, dyeing cloth with beetroot and whispering instructions to new apprentices. One merchant swore she was living in Rome, designing theatrical costumes under a false name, but no one could say for sure. What remained was her name, still written in the archives, still listed under fines, but no longer feared, because the crime had never been the silk dot. It had been the silence that followed. And Tessa Ritchie, she never gave them that. She left Florence not as a cautionary tale, but as a thread, one that others pulled, slowly, until the whole law unraveled. Naples, 14:9. To the sun there didn't simply rise. It drenched. The city gleamed with white stone, terracotta, and laughter spilling from balconies. Fishermen hauled nets that shimmered like wet lace. Boys chased each other through lemon groves and vanished into alleyways. And along the Via Toledo, women passed with heads bowed, but always, always watched. That year, the talk of the city wasn't about politics. It wasn't about warships or poets, or even the earthquake that had cracked the bell tower of San Lorenzo. It was about hair. Not just any hair. Blonde hair. Hair the color of ripened wheat, of Sicilian straw, of sun-burnished linen. It was rare in Naples, a city of deep brunettes and black-hooded widows. Blonde hair was an interruption, a halo you couldn't look away from, and it was causing a scandal. It began quietly, as such things do. A merchant's daughter, Celestina, began appearing at Sunday Mass with her hair uncovered. Not illegal, just frowned upon, more so because of the color. It wasn't gold, not truly, but a pale, warm blonde that glowed in the candlelight like honey on a white plate. She did not smile, did not flirt, but heads turned, whispers circled, and one priest, in a sermon not long after, said aloud, "Modesty is the oil that keeps the city from burning." The next week, Celestina's hair was covered in a sheer veil, barely visible, but still visible. That veil was the spark within. A month, 3 more girls had appeared with similarly lightened hair. Not born with it, bleached. You could tell by the reddish streaks near the scalp, the dryness at the ends. It was an old trick, lemon juice, lie. Hours spent under the sun, head tilted back in a wooden basin, letting the light change what God had given. And it wasn't done in shame. It was fashion that terrified the city, more than sin ever had, because Naples could handle lust. It had quarters for it, laws for it, prices for it. But fashion, contagious defiance, could not be taxed or contained. So the city turned its attention to the hair. Pamphlets appeared in market, handwritten and crude, locks of Lucifer, sun-blessed or hell-bound. Blonde is the devil's echo. Priests spoke of pride. Barbers were questioned. One old dye seller was arrested and held overnight for selling ungodly mixtures, and yet more blondes emerged. Asterisk. Not nobles, not courtesans, just ordinary women, grocers, daughters, widows, washerwomen, quietly changing the light that lived on their heads. It wasn't about beauty anymore. It was about being seen. One city magistrate proposed a ban. Another suggested a tax. But neither wanted to be remembered as the man who outlawed hair color. So instead, they targeted the girls through a different method. They sent officers to their homes to conduct moral inquiries. Nothing official, no charges, just visits, questions, suggestions that a blonde head might attract the wrong sort of men, that it might tarnish the reputation of a younger sister, that it might delay a marriage contract or lower a dowry. The message was clear. Change your hair. Poor, change your life. Celestina, the first blonde, was summoned before the archbishop. She arrived wearing black, her hair once again veiled, but no less visible. She was asked why she had done it. Her answer, because I could. The room went still. No apology, no poetry, just a fact. But in 15th century Naples, for a woman to assert choice and say nothing more was scandal enough. She was not punished. There were no laws to break. But the next day, her family was fined for a vague tax discrepancy. Her brother lost his position at the port, and by the end of the week she was gone. Some said she'd gone north. Others whispered she had joined a convent, trading sunlight for silence. But the hair remained. The city had tried to cut it down. It only grew brighter. What did these blonde girls want, really? Attention? Power? Or just to remind the city that identity could be chosen, strand by strand? And what happened to the girl who replaced Celestina and took the act one step further? Asterisk, her name was Marietta. She lived near the edge of Naples, where the breeze from the port carried salt into open windows and the smell of roasting. Fish hovered between rows of laundry. Her family sold charcoal, not a glamorous trade, but steady. Her father had thick hands. Her mother had no time for gossip, and Marietta had hair the color of chestnuts. Until the day she dinned, no one expected her to follow Celestina. She wasn't a seamstress. She didn't linger in markets. She didn't even attend church regularly. She watched the city more than she spoke to it. But in the weeks after Celestina disappeared, Marietta changed. It began with silence. She no longer answered her brothers when they teased her, no longer swept the front steps. She spent hours on the roof at midday, her head tilted back, bowl of lemon pulp and ashes by her side. Neighbors assumed she'd taken ill, or worse, fallen under a spell. But she was neither sick nor cursed. She was transforming Dot by the time she returned to the streets. Her hair glinted gold. Not natural, not soft. It had been stripped of pigment by the sun and scrubbed raw by brine. It was brittle, uneven, and stunning, not because it was beautiful, but because it was impossible to ignore. The city gasped. Celestina had been graceful. Marietta was deliberate. She did not veil. She did not bow. She walked straight-backed to the plaza near San Domenico, carrying charcoal wrapped in old cloth, with hair that blazed like a flag above her dot. And then she did the unthinkable. She spoke. A merchant commented that she looked like a northern courtesan. She stopped, turned to him, and said, "That's not an insult anymore. It's a comparison." That phrase was repeated for weeks, not because it was scandalous, but because it was calm. Marietta was not angry. She was certain, and certainty in a woman with dyed hair was more dangerous than any sermon. Soon, others followed her lead, not with blonde hair, but with choice. A girl named Annunziata cut her waist-length curls into a chin-length bob, claiming it dried faster. Another, Lucia, began weaving dyed ribbons into her braids, scarlet lapis, even silver thread. A widow named Donna Fiora wore her mourning veil pushed back so far it barely covered her crown. The church responded with parables, the barbers with warnings. But the city had grown weary of rules that only applied to the powerless, and then the girls, because that's what the city still called them, girls, even when they were mothers, wives. Widows did something that no one could have predicted. They stopped hiding the process. They bleached their hair in the open every Sunday. On the southern steps of Castel Nuovo, women gathered with bowls of vinegar, lye, crushed green grapes, and bitter orange peels. They sat in rows, backs to the sun, heads tilted toward the sea breeze. The air smelled of sour, citrus, and rebellion. Some covered their eyes with cloth to block the sting of light. Others sang. A few prayed aloud, and all of them let Naples watch. The city had two choices: ban the gathering, or pretend it wasn't happening. They chose the latter, because to confront the spectacle would be to admit it had power. So they ignored it, officially, but secretly. Records were kept, names written down, families questioned, whispers collected like kindling. And when the distillers ran out of lemons and vinegar, the city blamed Marietta. They summoned her, not to a court, but to a dinner, a private invitation from the wife of a local magistrate, one of those shadowy women who held enormous influence without ever being elected to anything. The note was sweet, respectful, full of compliments, but Marietta knew a trap when she saw one. She went anyway. She arrived in a plain wool dress, no makeup, no perfume. Her hair, now nearly white gold, fell loose around her shoulders. The dinner was quiet. Chicken stewed with olives, flatbread, fruit soaked in honey, and a single question: "Do you know how dangerous you're becoming?" Marietta placed her fork down and answered, "Do you know how ordinary your fear sounds?" That was the last straw. 2 days later, she was accused of disturbing the public modesty, an invented charge. No punishment attached, just a printed proclamation nailed to the city notice board. It was meant to shame her, to quiet her. Instead, it sparked a pageant. Women arrived at the next Sunday gathering in matching headscarves, not to hide their hair, but to mock the idea of uniformity. Someone embroidered disturber of modesty onto their sleeves. One woman carved it into the back of her wooden spoon. And then a strange thing happened. The men stopped watching, not out of offense, out of discomfort. The blonde hair no longer belonged to them, not as fantasy, not as temptation. It had become something else entirely, not rebellion. Definition. The city had tried to make Celestina an outlier. It made Marietta a movement. But could the women of Naples hold their ground, now that the threat of church censure was rising? Would the hair become a banner or a target? Asterisk by the spring of 1493, Naples was a city haunted by the color yellow, not the pale gold of noble tapestries, not the soft blonde of northern foreigners. This was a new yellow, rough, brassy, unapologetic, worn not as decoration, but as a declaration. Women began to leave strands of bleached hair on church steps, braided, tied with red string, and folded into the shape of a cross, not as mockery, as warning. Others pinned quotes to market walls. If hair leads men to sin, then teach men to close their eyes. My scalp is not your scripture. The church responded with fire, not literal burning, but sermons, longer, angrier, aimed directly at the women who had chosen to be seen. One friar in the district of San Giovanni stood in the plaza and shouted, "Each golden hair is a thread tied to the devil's tongue." He expected shame. He got applause. Women clapped, slowly, mockingly. not out of disrespect for God, but because they had grown tired of being told their bodies were someone else's battleground. Still, punishment came. Small, bureaucratic, but pointed. Charcoal was taxed higher. Lemon imports were limited. The dye merchants found their stores moved farther from the center of town. Midwives were asked to report women who had changed their appearance too drastically without cause. And then the church summoned Marietta a second time, not to dinner, but to confession. She declined, so they sent the priest to her, Father Girolamo, known for his gentleness, a man who wore his robes like a second skin, quiet and cautious. He visited her home with a book in one hand and olive oil in the other. "I am not here to accuse," he said, "only to ask why." She let him in, poured water, proffered bread, and then said, "Because I want to know what it feels like to be seen without being judged." He sat in silence, then asked, "Has it worked?" She tilted her head, thought, and finally said, "No, but it's made others ask the same question." That's enough. He did not fine her. He did not report her. But the following Sunday, his sermon was short. Only one sentence. Vanity is loudest when the soul has been silenced too long. The blonde women listened, and smiled, because for the first time someone had said what they had known all along. Their hair was not a sin. It was a symptom of something deeper, something unsaid. In the weeks that followed, the gatherings at Castel Nuovo stopped, not because the movement ended, but because it had spread. Blonde hair began to appear in villages north of Naples, in fishing towns along the coast, even in Palermo, where a noble woman was said to have cut her golden braid and placed it on the bishop's doorstep with a single note, "To whom does this offend?" The church tried to reassert control. It failed because it had no law to lean on, no scripture that banned sunlight, or lemon juice, or choice. And Naples, noisy, sun-soaked, chaotic Naples, simply moved on. Marietta, too, moved on, not out of exile, out of choice. She left the charcoal shop to her brother and walked west, toward the coast, carrying only a sack of herbs and a comb made from driftwood. Some said she opened a school for girls. Others claimed she taught northern traders how to dye wool without staining their skin. But those who stayed in Naples remembered her as she was, a girl who bleached her hair until it broke, simply to prove it was hers. And as the years passed, hair color faded in importance, trends shifted, mourning veils returned. The church found new enemies, but one thing remained. Every spring, on the anniversary of Celestina's disappearance, women left lemon rinds on the steps of San Domenico, and every year someone quietly swept them away, but never before noon, because even the church had learned that some stains weren't meant to be cleaned. Mantua, 1501. A city built on mirrors, not of glass, but of courtly behavior. Every gesture reflected another. Every smile was calculated. Every sigh rehearsed. Under the patronage of Isabella d'Este and the Gonzaga family, Mantua thrived as a polished gem in the crown of Renaissance Italy. Music echoed in marble corridors, perfume hung in the halls, and paintings bloomed across canvas and wall alike. One room, one hallway, really held a portrait. Unlike the others, it was large, expensive, commissioned by a duke, framed in walnut, rimmed with gold leaf. The woman depicted wore a velvet gown of forest green. Her hands rested on a bound book. Her expression was unreadable, regal, restrained. But there was one problem. Her face was turned away, not slightly, entirely, the jawline visible, the ear adorned, but the eyes absent, not painted, not hidden by a veil, just never included. The portrait hung just outside the Duke's private library, and beneath it a small brass plaque, "The Lady of Discretion, 1501, no name, no family crest, no painter's signature, and yet everyone in Mantua knew who it was. Duchess Caterina da Correggio, a woman so beautiful, so arresting, so luminously distracting, that she had once been forbidden to attend her own husband's council meetings. Not because she was impolite, not because she was loud, but because the men kept losing their train of thought. When she entered the room, it had become a joke, then a warning, and finally a rule. She had to remain behind the screen. At dinners, she sat behind embroidered curtains. At court ceremonies, she wore a translucent veil thickened with threads of black. Her voice could be heard, her advice sometimes taken, but her face rarely seemed out. It wasn't always like this. Caterina was born to a small, noble house in Parma. She was not meant to marry high. But at 17, during a winter feast hosted by the Gonzagas, she'd walked into the great hall wearing a silver gown and no jewelry. And the room, as the story went, stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. The Duke of Mantua, Federico, forgot his toast. The lute players missed their cue, and one visiting French ambassador reportedly dropped his goblet by spring. She was married by summer. She was hidden. The Dowager Duchess was the first to raise concern. She claimed Caterina's presence made the men uncertain, that her appearance weakened the spine of command. Within weeks, Caterina was asked gently, with great affection, to dine behind a curtain of lace. She agreed, not because she was meek, but because she was observant. She understood that power in Mantua was not always loud. Sometimes it whispered behind layers of silk. So she watched and listened, pit and remembered everything. But as time passed, her veils thickened, her outings shortened. The court began to speak of her as a ghost, ever present, never seen. Rumors began to bloom that she had been cursed with a second mouth beneath her chin, that her beauty caused nosebleeds, that she could kill a man with a glance. None of it was true. All of it was useful for those who needed her quiet, until the day a young painter arrived from Shima. Emon, his name was Jacopo, barely 20, brought to paint religious panels for the private chapel. He was good, quick, obedient, But after only 2 weeks at court, he was summoned by Catherine. She wanted a portrait, a private one. No sittings, no conversations. He was to be given fabric swatches, a profile sketch from years past, and her favorite book of poetry. He could visit the library to sketch. She would never be in the room. He agreed, but one evening, while gathering materials, he passed a narrow hallway and saw her just for a moment. Caterina stood alone, no veil, hair pinned in silver combs, reading, and he did not see beauty. He saw stillness, not the kind that comes from obedience, but from restraint held too long. He never told anyone, but when the portrait was unveiled, weeks later, it sent a shiver through the court, not because it was scandalous, but because it was incomplete, deliberately so. The Duchess's face turned away, her eyes hidden, her beauty implied but denied, and yet the painting radiated presence. The room around her seemed quieter. The folds of her gown bent as if the air feared to crease them, and the book in her lap, the pages were painted mid-turn, as if she'd just looked up, as if she'd almost met your gaze, as if she'd refused, softly, deliberately, to be captured. No one knew why she had chosen that pose, but whispers returned, not of curses this time, of power, quiet, unyielding, reflected back to the city, not with a smile, but with silence. But what was Caterina truly doing, hidden behind screens and veils? And why did her disappearance from court soon follow, just weeks after the painting was hung? Asterisk, the portrait stayed on the wall. The Duchess did not. 3 weeks after the painting was unveiled, Caterina da Correggio left the palace. No public notice, no ceremony. Not even a whispered reason, at first. No one asked. It was common enough for noble women to retreat to villas during the heat, or to take the waters at spa towns. But then the heat passed, and she didn't return. No new portraits appeared. No letters arrived bearing her seal. Her husband, Duke Federico, carried on with his affairs, always smiling, always vague. She sends her prayers, he told guests. The mountains are good for her nerves. But the staff knew something was wrong. Her rooms had been emptied, gowns folded, shoes boxed, her carved hair combs left behind, stacked neatly beside a brush missing most of its bristles. She hadn't fled. She had prepared, and then a servant bound the letters tucked between the pages of a poetry book in the palace library, the same book Jacopo had used to paint the Duchess's folded hands. The letters weren't sealed. They were undated. Some were addressed, some were not, all in Caterina's hand. But none had ever been sent. The first was to her younger sister in Parma, a tender account of life behind the curtain. I am seen more now that I'm hidden. Isn't that strange? They whisper of me as if I were a storm, and yet all I've done is read and breathe and remember the names of men who forget mine. Another was to her mother. I've learned that beauty can be louder than disobedience. A glance, a stillness, the refusal to shrink. These unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Pow! And then one with no addressee, written in a slanted hand. as if composed during a walk or in the corner of a darkened room. They think they've removed me, but it's the opposite. I have placed myself exactly where they cannot touch me, not in their halls, but in their memory, their fears, their paintings. Some of the court wanted to destroy the letters, others wanted to lock them away, but Jacopo, the young painter, did something else. He read them, and then he painted again, not another portrait of Caterina, but of her curtain, a large canvas, the folds of heavy brocade rendered with painstaking care. No figure, no furniture, just the fabric. But in the lower corner, where the light struck just right, you could almost see the ghost of a silhouette, blurred, soft, as if someone had just stepped behind it. Paul was about to step forward. He titled it Presenza. The court dismissed it as abstract, but others knew better. It was an answer to every question. The Duchess had refused to answer aloud, and soon women across Mantua began copying the style, not of the dress, of the decision. They took up veils, not in mourning, not in shame, but in strategy. One noble woman began attending public events with her back turned to the audience. Another ordered a gown with sleeves so wide they covered her hands even when lifted. A third commissioned a brooch shaped like a closed eye. It became a language, gesture instead of display, stillness instead of permission. The men mocked it, of course, but their meetings grew shorter, their glances more uncertain, because silence, when chosen, has weight, and Caterina's absence grew heavier each month. Finally, a rumor reached the court, that she had taken up residence in a small villa outside Ferrara, not a convent, not a retreat, a house with no servants, no visitors, and no mirrors. She was said to spend her days walking through a grove of almond trees, writing letters she never mailed. One merchant swore he passed her once, pale, veiled, carrying a book with no title on the spine. She looked at him just once, and he forgot what he was selling. Another claimed she was helping young girls learn to read, that she banned books inside baskets of vegetables, that she taught them how to write poetry in the margins of prayer books. But these stories were unverified. She never returned to Mantua. The portrait remained. The painting of the curtain was moved to a smaller hallway, and eventually even the plaque beneath her image was stolen, not in time. Newer faces filled the court, bolder, louder, more compliant, but none were remembered the way Caterina was, because she had done what few women were allowed to do in that world. She had rewritten her presence and turned her silence into a shadow they could never quite remove. Venice, 1514. In the lagoon city where gondolas brushed the walls of convents and incense, drifted between bell towers and tiled rooftops, there stood a cloister known for its silence, Santa Zita del Vergine, tucked behind a fish market and a crumbling statue of Saint Jerome, was a place for forgotten women, daughters without dowries, widows too young, noble girls whose beauty caused more worry than joy. It was not a cruel place, but it was a place of containment. The rules were simple: veils at all times, no mirrors in shared quarters, and no woman to be addressed by her birth name after entry, only her chosen saint. Sister Fiorenza entered the convent at 17. She did not choose her name. It was chosen for her by the abbess, because her birth name, Lia della Torre, had already been whispered too many times through the canals. She had been the daughter of a wine merchant and a courtesan, not noble, not poor, but dangerous in her visibility. Her hair was the color of ripe apricots, her skin pale enough to seem lit from beneath, and when she walked near the Doge's palace during a summer festival, men were said to have stumbled on their words, their feet, and their commitments. By 16, 2 proposals had been made. One was rescinded after a chancellor's wife visited the family and left with a cold smile. The other, from a man twice Leah's age, was accepted, then revoked when it became clear that Leah did not blush at compliments, nor flinch at silence. Her beauty did not behave the way people preferred, so she was sent away, not in punishment, in protection. Santa Zita accepted her with open arms and closed eyes. There her hair was cut, her clothes replaced with thick linen, her voice softened to fit the rhythm of prayer. But the silence she stepped into was not one of peace. It was tension, wrapped in devotion, because the other nuns noticed, even in the absence of mirrors, even beneath the veil. Sister Fiorenza could not hide. Her cheekbones made shadows fall differently. Her fingers were long, delicate, the kind that made old icons look suddenly human. Her movements, even when purposeful, carried the suggestion of grace, and her eyes, large, pale green, unsettled the sisters during Vespers. One novice whispered that she could see through marble. Another claimed that a visiting friar had forgotten his own sermon while looking at her. The abbess grew nervous, not of Fiorenza's behavior. She obeyed every rule, but of her effect. She ate little, spoke less, and yet still filled the cloister with unease. Her presence disrupted the order of holy invisibility, and so new rules appeared. Sister Fiorenza was to rise 1 hour earlier for prayers alone. She was assigned to scrub the candle soot from the chapel ceiling, a task that left her robes always stained. She was asked to avoid speaking to visiting clergy unless spoken to first, and she was no longer allowed in the garden when more than 2 sisters were present. None of this was punishment. It was containment. But Fiorenza endured, not out of humility, but calculation. She had learned that silence could be shaped, that stillness could become armor, and that when people fear the surface of a thing, they rarely look beneath it, until one night in the cold months, something changed. A painter arrived. Brother Matteo, a Dominican friar, was commissioned to repaint the cloister's chapel ceiling, a faded scene of saints in poorly drawn clouds. He was known not just for his art, but for his insistence on drawing his figures from living inspiration. The abbess agreed to his presence reluctantly, on the condition that the sisters would remain behind the screen during his visits. But on the 3rd day, he saw Fiorenza. She had been scrubbing a stone basin when the screen curtain fluttered open, just for a moment, enough for her to turn her head, enough for light to fall across her face. He froze. She did not look away. He asked the abbess later if he could meet her, just to speak, just to understand the structure of her hands. For a saint he was painting. The abbess refused. The next day, Fiorenza's chores were moved to the storage cellar, and the painter left the convent 2 weeks later, having finished his commission in silence. But when the fresco was unveiled, months later, something was strange. In the corner of the painting, barely visible, above the shoulder of St. Lucy, a figure knelt, not a saint, not a sinner, a veiled woman facing away, but her hands were folded in such a way that every nun in Santa Zita knew it was her. Fiorenza, the painter, had included her, not fully, not scandalously, just enough to whisper her presence into permanence. The abbess had the corner covered with plaster, but rumors had already reached the city that there was a nun behind the walls of Santa Zita whose face had almost entered the holy record, whose presence alone had cracked the surface of devotion, whose beauty, unwanted, undemanded, had nearly bled through paint. And what did Fiorenza do once her image was erased? Did she protest, cry, retreat? No, she made a plan. But what kind of plan can a veiled woman in a locked convent make? And how do you escape a place that was built for silence? The convent bell rang, as always, 5 times before dawn, once at noon, 3 before vesper. It marked time like a net, catching every hour before it could slip into memory. But something inside Santa Zita had begun to loosen, not in the stone. In the air, it was Sister Fiorenza, after her veiled image had been painted, then covered. Something shifted, not in her behavior, which remained obedient and precise, but in her silence, which became somehow intentional, focused, measured. She began to linger longer in the scriptorium, offering to assist the old nun who copied psalms. She mended curtains with fingers that worked more slowly than necessary. She volunteered to sweep the archive hallway, where visitors were sometimes received. She was no longer just quiet. She was present, and the other sisters, unsure how to respond, began to move around her like birds around a still cat, watchful, uneasy. Then, during the first full moon of spring, a curious thing happened. A new veil appeared, finer than any they had seen, woven from a linen silk blend, not typically used in the convent, pale ivory, edged with a thread so faint it seemed invisible unless the light struck just right. Fiorenza wore it during the morning prayers. Nothing about it broke the rules, but it glowed. The abbess noticed. She said nothing, but 2 days later, Fiorenza was summoned privately and reminded of the vow of Amilta, humility. Fiorenza nodded, then gently asked, was it the veil or how I wore it? The abbess dismissed her, but she kept the veil. That night, in the stillness of her cell, Fiorenza removed the veil from her head and spread it across her cot. She reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a dull piece of charcoal, the kind used to mark cloth before cutting dot, and she began to draw dot lines, arches, angles, the outline of the convent courtyard, the cracks in the chapel floor, the rhythm of the bell ropes, the narrow wall in the back corridor where the paint flaked away, revealing a hairline opening in the plaster. She wasn't drawing a map of escape. She was drawing a memory of movement, all the ways she had learned to pass through the convent unnoticed, all the places where sound softened, where shadows fell deepest, where eyes turned away. She didn't plan to flee. She planned to be seen on her own terms. And then the second veiled dot, this one she made herself, loosely stitched, lined with faded rose thread. From a distance, ordinarily, but up close, the stitching formed words, tiny, almost illegible, not psalms, not names, questions. What is beauty if it is never chosen? Who decides what light? Piss aloud through the glass. Is silence holy, or simply useful? She wore it to supper. No one noticed at first, but the eldest sister, nearly blind, but a former embroiderer, squinted as Fiorenza passed and whispered, "You've stitched defiance." Fiorenza said nothing, but the whisper traveled. The next day, a novice approached her in the garden, shaky, barely old enough to recite the full litany. "May I read it?" Fiorenza handed her the veil, asterisk,